Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, let's talk about the two major spawns that aren't the bass spawn that you should be paying attention to right now. This is a really, really critical time of the year, especially if you're fishing tournaments. These are two different patterns that you need to look for on your lakes right now. And especially, one is especially important to pay attention to as far as timing. First off, I do want to mention that if you guys have any questions at all that you want me to do a video on, make sure you drop a comment below. I know during tournament season, sometimes it gets a little bit slower, me responding to comments, but I do read each comment, just to let you know. So I apologize for not answering every single comment, but I do read them, and if they're questions that I definitely feel like I can weigh in on, I'm definitely going to do a video on them because that's how I get a lot of content. And also, just make sure you hit that subscribe button and the like button if you do end up liking the content that you see. It just helps me, grow this channel, and SonarFishing is growing very, very quickly. So anyways, thank you guys very much. Let's dive right into talking about these two different spawns that you need to be paying attention to. So the last two tournaments on Toledo Bend and on Bugs Island, that of which we will not mention because I had a terrible tournament there. Both of those events had a certain spawn going on that it resulted in a lot of big fish catches. Unfortunately, mine kind of dried up. My areas just were not popping at that particular 2-day period. Essentially what was going on was the shad spawn, and also a little bit of a herring spawn, I think. But we're not going to primarily be talking about shad because I don't know a lot about the herring spawn, so I'm not going to touch up on it as much, but it is somewhat similar. But the shad spawn, I did a great video on talking about the shad spawn, what it looks like, the type of baits that you should be throwing, and all of that. And you can find that on the channel. I think it's a couple weeks ago. That is a pretty good video to watch if you're interested in more information on the shad spawn. But essentially, this is the time of year when it usually happens after the bass spawn. So once the water temperatures get into the high 60s, especially around the full moon, a lot of the same conditions that you'd expect bass to kind of like, a big wave of bass to move up to spawn, the shad kind of do the same thing, just at a warmer water temperature. But you start seeing a lot of bait fish up shallow, and in the mornings, in low light conditions, you start seeing, fish visually, the shad visually popping out of the water, it just looking like they're being attacked. And essentially they're laying the eggs and fertilizing the eggs up shallow on shallow type of cover. It could be a rocky bank, it could be wood, it could be a vegetation, all kinds of things. The buoyant eggs stick to the objects, and then the male shad fertilize the eggs, and then they end up hatching from those objects. So that's essentially what's going on. And this phenomenon is a great opportunity to catch a lot of fish quickly, and also big fish. And it happens on all these lakes that have a shad on it, and you have to be very, very observant. So a couple of really key things that I look for finding a shad spawn deal is, number one, kind of main lake or main creek structure. It could be channel swings. What I gather over the years, in my experience, the shad really like to spawn close to deep water access. So like if you have, it may be in the back of a creek, it may be a little bit shallower, but you're usually going to find the best shad spawn, the strongest shad spawn, where you have a creek channel bend where the deep water access is pretty quick. That was the same thing for Toledo Bend. I was fishing a shad spawn around cypress knees, and the best areas were where the creek channel kind of butt up against a line of cypress trees. So they had deep water access, but they could go shallow into the shallow cover and go ahead and do their business. And so you definitely want to be observant. The one big key about the shad spawn is it is a major timing deal. You have to be out there early in the morning and run a lot of areas to find the right areas, or the areas where it's actually going down. And so get out there before daylight and start fishing some of those main lake areas, and odds are you're going to be able to stumble across a shad spawn. But pay attention to not only, you know, the shad that are you know, not only look for shad that are coming out of the water and visually, you know, showing themselves, but also make sure that you pay attention while you're reeling your bait in, because a lot of times the shad spawn, like at Bugs Island, the only way you could tell there's a shad spawn going on was the fact that when you bring in your spinner bait, like this one right here, this is Z-Man Sling Blades, I'd have about a half dozen or more shad bumping into my spinnerbait on the way back. I didn't ever see them actually spawning on the surface, you know, coming out of the water like they normally do, but I saw a ton of them bump into my spinnerbait. And often I'd know exactly what's going on when I'd cast up to the bank and I'd be reeling it in, and it'd feel like your spinnerbait stopped spinning. You know, the blade stopped spinning for briefly, and it's because those shad are bumping into the spinnerbait. Same thing will happen with a lot of different moving baits that you throw, but I'd say a spinnerbait is probably one of the best baits that you can use during the shad spawn, depending on the situation. Chatterbait's also good. Swim jig is also good. Topwater is also good. But a spinnerbait is kind of hard to beat. It really imitates a nice little group of shad very well. So shad spawn is definitely something you need to pay attention to, but make sure you get out early. And usually if it's a sunny day, that window of opportunity is going to be very narrow. But if it's a cloudy day, or maybe even a little bit more wind and clouds, that can extend out quite a ways. I would say that under sunny conditions, really you're looking at, you know, maximum maybe out to 8:30. Once the sun hits the water, you know, in a shad spawn area, it really starts to dissipate quick. But during cloudy conditions, it can go out to 10:30, 11 o'clock, depending on the situation that you're presented with. Another thing to pay attention to is shaded banks. So like some areas that were good earlier in the morning when it was low light because the sun hasn't gotten up yet, may turn off, while others remain on because you have a little bit of shade on those sides banks. So pay attention to the shade banks during the shad spawn. The other spawn is the bluegill spawn. Both of these are forage species, which is why they're so important. But the bluegill spawn is another one that's happening in May, and it's another one that happens after the bass spawn. And usually it happens once the temperatures start getting into the 70s. You start seeing the bluegill up shallow around the high 60s, but then you start noticing beds and some bigger bluegill once it starts getting into the 70s. And once you start seeing those real distinct honeycomb pattern bed, you know, they're like little congregations of beds. Once you start seeing that, you're in for a treat sometimes, because if they're actively spawning on those honeycomb formations and you've got a bunch of bluegill up there, there's usually bass very close by. They may not be visible. They may just be in slightly deeper water where you can't see them, but usually the bass have a bone to pick with these bluegill after the spawn, because the bass have been constantly pestered and bullied by these bluegills while they're on the bed, because those bluegills want the bass eggs. And I just think that there's a component of redemption after the bass spawn and when the bluegill are spawning, and that's why the bass will hang around and viciously attack these bluegills while they're on the bed. Some baits to throw during the bluegill spawn, anything that stays in the area for a long length of time. You don't want something that moves very quickly through the bluegill spawn area. So poppers are very good. Frogs are also very good. So those are some really good top waters. You can use some type of walking bait and slowly work it through there. But I'd say poppers and frogs are two of the absolute best top waters for a bluegill spawn. And then beyond that, you know, a wacky rig is really difficult to beat. for a subsurface presentation that goes slow, because you know, those wacky rigs really like to stay in the strike zone longer. You work them a little bit slower, and they do wonders around bluegill spawns. And usually, if you catch a fish around the bluegill spawn, they're big enough to put their mouth around a big spawning bluegill, so they're usually pretty darn decent fish. But anyways, guys, those are just some thoughts on the two main spawns other than the bass spawn that you need to be paying attention to right now. Usually you look for them late April all the way through May, and maybe even into early June sometimes in some parts of the country. But anyways, guys, let me know what you think about the content today and the topic. And make sure that you drop a question again if you have a question you want me to do a video on. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, trust the process, and I'm going to see you out on the water. Take care.